Joining me now is Mircea Joanna. He's Deputy Secretary General of NATO. It's an honor to have you here. And also Matt Schluter, who is the Managing Director and Partner with the Boston Consulting Group. Great to have you both with us here today. Deputy Secretary General, let me start with you. We've heard a lot about the innovation landscape writ large. How do you perceive NATO's role within this landscape?
You know, historically, the ones who are leading and winning the technological race are having strategic superiority. It's a fact of life. So NATO, the most important alliance in history, we have in our DNA permanent adaptation and transformation. That's what we do as we speak. I chair the innovation board in NATO. I also chair the cyber adaptation effort in NATO. I also do, speaking of Minister Lambrecht, she was great, by the way, at her first defense ministerial. I come straight from the airport, from Brussels. So it's very, very important for us, all of us in the Euro-Atlantic area, is to foster the talent we have, the fact that we still have technological edge. This is contested for the first time probably in centuries. And this is why NATO is the indispensable platform to harness innovation and technologies for defense and security.
Matt, what more should NATO be thinking about?
So thanks, Jane. So a couple things as we think about NATO, specifically and more broadly. I think in the research we did, we spoke with 59 different ministries of defense, as well as the EU and NATO. So this is very broad and across. But one thing I'd offer on the point of talent is what we saw is there's a lot of ministries that have an ambition, that have a public ambition. But what we saw is that the context for their people to actually action that ambition hasn't changed. What I mean by that is the rewards and the incentives that are in place need to be adjusted so that people are rewarded for taking on some of the initiatives we talked about tonight. And the issue we found is many of them, I could talk to some of the numbers, 59% of people, or the respondents on their innovation team, felt that it wasn't an attractive destination for the best talent. 64% of people on average, across all the MODs we looked at, they felt that, go ahead.
Can I ask why?
Yeah, so it's all that context. It's the context around, are they getting incentivized? Are they rewarded for pursuing some of the ambition? And I'll give one example. When you look at the portfolio of initiatives that are done, many people tend to bias towards near-term initiatives because that's what they're rewarded for. They're rewarded for more risk-averse initiatives. That's what the data showed us in the research. So as we talk about both NATO and all the ministries of defense, it's about changing some of the reward structure to incentivize people to take on some of those more bigger initiatives that they can.
NATO has been trying to address the talent issue. Tell us about your success or challenges.
We do, and the beauty of this great alliance, that we have 30 allies, 1 billion people, more than 50-something% of global GDP is in NATO countries. And I read and I contributed to the BSG report. I was interviewed, and I salute the fact that MSC and BSG are doing this. And we also struggle with these issues in governments. But the usefulness of NATO is the fact that we can match very important allies, US and Germany and many others that have very deep venture capital markets, very endowed universities. They attract talent also from worldwide with the smaller allies. Because the fact that NATO is addressing new technologies like AI and data exploitation, quantum, biotechnology, space, unmanned vehicles, of course, supersonic, hypersonic missiles, is in fact, the business of NATO is to keep all allies, what we call in our jargon, interoperable. So, meaning they should be able to exercise together, to train together, and God forbid, even fight together. For this means that one size fits all doesn't work. I agree with the BSG report. But NATO is that irrespective of the 30 nations with different sizes, the output of NATO is a homogeneous alliance, of course, able to use technologies in a way that will make all our militaries. Look at the new technology of space. Look at cyber. Look at resilience. Look at AI. This will mean that we have to be able to do things together. Speaking of talent, Of course, that is the financial reward is important for everyone.
And you're competing against private industry. Which
Yes, but
can
let me
offer a
tell you
big
something.
paycheck.
Let me tell you something, Jean, something very interesting. We organized in NATO a competition for 12 jobs as young professionals. You know how many applications we got for 12 jobs in NATO? 14,000 applications to join our work. Why? Because these youngsters, when they hear about NATO, they feel that there is something more than just a job. There's something more than just having some KPIs and some return on investment. They feel that they are doing something important to keep 1 billion people safe and keep the world safe. So that's a strong incentive for what we do after we get the talent, how we retain them, how to continue to motivate them. That's a different story. But NATO is a very attractive brand. And this is also our job, Secretary General's, my job, is to make sure that we also communicate. And so that's what we are trying to do.
So with all those applicants, did you really only hire 12 of them? There must have been scores.
But others will probably continue to apply for jobs. We'll do something quite interesting with them, just to keep them motivated and also to put the seed of the future leaders of this alliance. Because now they're very young. In a few years' time flies fast, they will come to be in my position. So what we offer for them, 3 years, and every 6 months they rotate in a different part of the NATO ecosystem. In headquarters in Brussels, then they go to SHAPE, then they go to Norfolk, then they go to NCIA, to our agencies. So after 3 years, this wonderful group and others like them will be understanding what NATO represents and will be able to do whatever job they will be assigned to be doing. And also something that we also do in NATO differently. We have roughly 50% of our staff is permanent staff. The rest are rotating. So we are also very proud when people come and serve in NATO, work for us, and then after a few years they leave for something else. Better, smarter, better leaders, and also understanding the importance of NATO and of our alliance.
I'm curious if, in addition to having people rotate within NATO, you also have people who go into private industry for a stretch, planned, and then come back to you. And so there's cross-fertilization.
This is sort of a European jargon. It's called passerelle. So basically a two-way street between private sector and NATO. We have also, speaking of cyber, of course, we say nice words about ourselves, but we don't have enough talent to cover the immense needs. So sometimes we hire consultants, sometimes nations send what they call secondments to us. We even have people seconded to us from Australia. I work in my team with a bright young woman from Finland. They're not a member, but they are part of what we do together. And by the way, we had today at the NATO Defense Ministerial, we had a session with Georgia and Ukraine, very important. But in the afternoon, we had something with Sweden, Finland, and Josep Borrell from the European Union. So that's probably NATO is a bit more flexible. It doesn't appear like this because we also have our military component. But NATO is a quite interesting organization. And that's why I think we have a better chance to attract and retain talent.
I think that's great. There's one point I'd pick up on based on your comments from what the DSG said. It's you talked about the homogenization kind of across NATO and helping people work together. One thing I commend NATO for, and I think this is something that the data would say needs to be replicated across more partnerships, is the governance around some of the partnerships. So what we found, which was actually quite surprising in a lot of the data, is that there's no lack of partnerships. Many people say we need more partnerships. There's actually a lot of partnerships out there. But what's missing is actually the governance around those partnerships. So what we found is, especially on investments, and especially on syndicating information and communicating, that's not done nearly as well as it needs to be. I know that's one in some of our discussions. That's one thing NATO's doing quite well from our view in terms of the ability to syndicate that information and the ability to do things around investing that other partnerships need to replicate.
There is something else that NATO is very useful to our allies. Of course, allies have the national defense forces. They have what it takes. We are just in case in need, we take over and we do our job. So what's interesting and beautiful and interesting about NATO and useful to nations is that we in a way, we congregate the multiple national experiences of allies. So I call and I invite DARPA to speak to us. You know that DARPA, the famous agency, they have only 200 people. That's all they've had. They have a budget, but nobody is basically hired other than on the length, the duration of one project. Then they leave. Then I go to the Czech Republic, and then I go to Montenegro, then I go to beautiful Estonia, then I go to my home country, Romania. And everybody is supposed to have defense planning, including spending money, a lot or little money, according to the GDP, on things that make sense for defense planning together in NATO. So NATO is a force of federation of ideas. Sometimes things that do not work are also shared amongst the allies. Listen, I tried that, it failed. This is good for the other allies not to make the same error, because sometimes it's trial and error that is the mother of progress.
Do member countries always want to share, or do they have a proprietary interest in holding their intellectual property close?
Of course, it's normal. Every national government has a natural tendency and an obligation to protect the industry, to make sure the intellectual property is used to the benefit of the citizens and the taxpayers. That's absolutely normal. That's what politicians do. But again, when it comes to NATO, the business of NATO is to keep all of us safe. So this is priceless, and this is where nations share in NATO more eagerly than in a normal multinational, international organization, because this is about our security, our safety, and the future of our kids. So I would say that NATO, not everybody is sharing everything, let's not go there, but they share far more. And there is an intimacy amongst us and a level of trust amongst us. And also, we are an organization that is not leaking information to our adversaries. So people trust that when there is something that comes to NATO, that information is safe. That technology is in good hands. And that's why NATO is probably a place where nations share more than in normal situations.
Matt, in your study, did you find that there were shortcomings in the way that some militaries kept track of their innovation and measured their progress?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, that was the impetus for the whole study. I mean, what we heard in many of the interviews that we did is there's a number of great activities happening. We heard everything from, hiring, reorganizations and hiring new chief innovation officers and Silicon Valley tours, and that's all great. But to actually systematically quantify and measure your ability to innovate, that's the critical piece of insight that was missing. And that's what was helpful when we brought in the commercial perspective that Rich alluded to earlier, in terms of the thousands of interviews we've done in the last 15 years of surveying innovators on the commercial side. We were able to use that framework and had a holistic framework across 11 dimensions that helped to quantify. And the feedback we've gotten initially is it's done three things. One is it's been more precise than people have seen previously, which is helpful. Secondly, it's helpful to see comparatively how you actually compare with the private sector. But I think most importantly, the feedback we've got is the third element, which is it provides a heat map for ministries to be able to look and say, hey, where do I need to improve? And when I make an investment, is it paying off? So that's what we provide with this report. I think it's filling a gap that, at least from the information we heard, it was actually missing in many different ministries.
No, that's a very useful exercise, because sometimes people from the outside, they have sometimes, if you want, a more distanced, but also in a way more lucid view of things. Let me say one thing. Every year, Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, as an obligation, publishes the report on what we call burden sharing. And it's interesting to see that after the occupation of Crimea illegally by Russia in 2014, defense spending in NATO was going down, abruptly down. That was a wake-up call. And in the last 7-8 years from 2014, allied nations together spend more than $217 billion extra. In a way, it's the opposite of what Mr. Putin had the intention to.
Of course, you also had President Trump chastising
all American presidents had made the point, and I think this is a correct point to make. So even if not all allies have reached the 2% threshold, 24 of the 30 allies have reached the other sub-indicator, which is to spend more than 20% on new equipments and on R&D. This means that slowly and relatively interestingly, the way in which national MODs and national establishments are spending the money is becoming more and more towards new technologies, and this is in a way creating critical mass also for the industry. And something I would like to say, and this is something that we are trying to do. Sometimes, now 90% of innovation that is used for defense and security is produced by the private sector. It's the opposite of the 70s. So it's also our interest, and that's what I'm doing. I'm on a roadshow almost every day in talking to industry, and not only to usual defense industry, but also to technology, to startups, to venture capital, and to tell them how do we anticipate the utility and also the risk of new technologies. And the moment they hear from us, they can be, also private sector, can be even more useful to defense needs of allied nations.
Yeah, Matt, what did you find?
Really interesting point that the DSG mentions, and what I'd highlight is when you talk about the pivot that happened, when governments used to provide more of the innovation, now it's the private sector, there's an implication of that we've seen. And what we saw in the data is it drives more of a near-term bias in the types of innovations that are purchased. And it's taken the role of government findings. What we had is that ministries have a unique position to play a much greater role in the defense marketplace than they have previously. So what does that mean? It means things like setting standards for open systems, which is something only a ministry could do on behalf of everyone. It's other things such as, providing the end user feedback and talking about future upgrades earlier in the process. It's things like using the authorities that are available. We heard a whole bunch in the surveys about, we can't innovate fast enough, or industry has a lead. There's actually a lot of authorities available, both in we like to both NATO and non-NATO countries, but pretty much across the board, the authorities are available to do a lot of what needs to be done for the ministries to better influence that market.
That's why we have, and I think this is the most interesting evolution in NATO. Our leaders at the Brussels summit last June decided for NATO, upon our proposal, to create what we call a Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, DIANA, the acronym. What's this? It's a collection of test centers, of accelerators, of places where all over the alliance research and development is done. And also we are now creating, for the first time, a NATO Innovation Fund. It's not a lot of money, 1 billion or something. You cannot compare with venture capital and financial markets. But this money will be very important because this will be seed money for startups and SMEs and innovators that will have at their disposal, free of charge, the DIANA ecosystem, so the sandboxes, and then if we put a little money on a new, smart, promising technology, it's also a stamp of approval, and then with that product, they can go on the real markets, get the real money, and we'll make sure that also that capital is trusted. And this is something that is a beautiful evolution in NATO as an aggregator and as a common denominator on the high up for all member states, big and small, North American or European, Eastern European, Northern European, Southern European. That's what we are doing things together and harnessing the talent of our innovation ecosystem.
Matt, did you also look at how militaries engage with academia, or was that outside the scope?
We did look at it, and what we found is it's in looking at partnerships in general. We looked at academia, we looked at industry, we looked at accelerators, we looked at hubs and so forth. And so in many ways we looked at all of them together, and that's where the findings came twofold. I touched on earlier that it's not about the volume of partnerships, it's really the value and how you govern those partnerships. But what I would mention is also it's the focus of some of the partnerships. So what we found, and DSG Giwana alluded to it, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We felt that defense ministries really need to look at 5 different business models, and why that's important is their partnering strategy needs to follow suit. What we found is in some of the feedback we got, they said, I need to have a relationship with this university because we heard someone else does, or this university because someone else does. That shouldn't be the driver. The driver should be your respective business model, what you're trying to get out of the innovation ecosystem, what you're trying to contribute based on your comparative advantage, and that should drive your partnering strategy rather than the other way.
We also try to do something, and this report is just great, and we'll make sure we disseminate it across the alliance. Secretary General Stoltenberg basically created an advisory group on innovation for NATO. And of course, I work more closely with this group. That's 10 people, men and women from across the alliance, with superb experience in business, in academia, in AI, in quantum, in physics, in space, everything. And they provide to us, upon a conversation with us, an annual report. This is the second report that they issued today. It's on what? Human capital and how to harness the innovation ecosystem, what they call the triple helix between private sector, public sector, academia, and civil society. So what I'm just trying to say, and if you look to the first annual report of this group, I think that more than 80% of their recommendations are already policy adopted, approved in NATO. So I think that with an organization with our size, and big bureaucracies are sometimes small, I think we're becoming more agile. Also, we're trying to improve procurement, which is an obstacle. We want to make sure that we don't buy equipment for yesterday or for today, but for the day after tomorrow. So I think that NATO is in a process of massive positive transformation. And in Madrid at our next summit, I know that our leaders will give us, also in the strategic concept, a lot of attention to new technologies, to what they call EDTs, and for NATO to keep its technological edge, because in the end, that's military supremacy, and that's the business of NATO.
You mentioned interoperability, and in previous conversations I've had with people from NATO, they've indicated that has been challenging. Do you feel you have conquered the interoperability problem?
This is a struggle that happens every day. We are now 73 years old as an organization, and we are considered to be the most successful alliance in history. Why? Because every single day we struggle to improve. No, it's not perfect. No, it's not perfect. But we are aware of the strong points and also of the weaker points, and we try to address in a lucid way those issues. I know one thing, that interoperability is one of the most, other than values, what is basically binding all of us together? 1 billion people, 30 nations. It's our values, our shared interest to protect our population from any harm, and then to be able to work together and eventually fight together. So for us, it's bread and butter. There's no day, no second that we are not thinking of how we can make our armed forces and our military and also our technological ecosystems work better together. And that's a struggle that we'll continue to do quite aggressively in the years to come.
I would like to ask each of you what you think is the biggest obstacle to more rapid and successful innovation. Matt, why don't I start with you on that one?
So consistently throughout the research we did, whether it was on their overall ability to innovate as an organization, whether it was specific initiatives and looking at the ROI, the lack of measurement and the lack of understanding and ability to quantify is what we thought was one of the biggest impediments. And so when they went to get support, being able to communicate, well, what was the value of what I actually did and demonstrate that? There's a lot of money being spent in a lot of places, but the ROI, the value that was achieved from that, that's what was missing. And so that's one piece that we think as that's further embedded, it will help a lot of the different dimensions. It'll help the talent to see what they're delivering. It'll help to get more funding. It'll help to change the culture and mindset. So that's really one of the fundamental aspects of changing the overall ecosystem and being more helpful for MODs that are participating in it.
Listen, I'm a political guy.
For better or worse, I might.
No, for better. For better. Because I lived in my many incarnations the struggle of governments and bureaucracies to be up to the job. What I believe is the most important challenge for us, and we are really fighting as much as we can with that one, is the fact that there is a sort of a misconception that innovation is only for innovators, that innovation is for the chief innovation officer, or we hired from private sector, a new CIO for NATO. We are so proud of that. He came from private industry. He never worked one day in his life in a bureaucracy. He came from private sector. We recruited him. Great addition to our team. So what I'd like to say that the most important challenge is to have a culture of innovation across the board. From the small thing that our fantastic photographer here does better to everything we do. So a culture of innovation is a state of mind, and it's a way to run business. It's not just a segment of people that are quite smart, very smart, super smart, and the rest do the regular business of the day. So that's the business I'm doing on behalf of the Secretary General, to instill a culture of innovation on everything we do. And then, when I understand what really innovation means, then a certain, if you know, slowness that is part of big bureaucracies is replaced by something with agility, ingenuity, and less risk-averse mentalities in some of our institutions. So I think we're on the right track. We have a long, difficult journey ahead of us. And I have to say this is for the first time in many centuries, this is a challenge for technological supremacy that we must win. And we will win that one.